There's people in the world that think these kids should just be put down and that they're not worth it. That's pretty much almost word for word what it says in that book. I tried to debate this with this guy and didn't go really that well, but it was still somewhat respectful until he finally said, "You know what? I'm going to read your book." And after he read my book, he sent me the most scathing, awful email I think I've ever received
Oh,
since writing that book. He basically told me everything that happened to me was my fault and that I was just a little boy that needs to pull up my big boy pants and stop crying about daddy beating you. It was horrible.
hello everybody. Today I have the great pleasure of talking with Kelvin Pierce. Kelvin wrote a book, which I have here, much thumbed, called The Sins of My Father. Kelvin's father was William Pierce, who was the best known American Nazi of his time, I think we could say. Certainly an inheritor of George Lincoln Rockwell. The book is, I had to come and find you once I'd read the book a few years ago, but because it's such a terrible description of childhood, with a brutal, terrible father, who was the author of the Turner Diaries, which inspired Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber. And your father did a great deal of damage. Now, what fascinated me about the book was your character arc, your transition from this terrible childhood through, of course, the isolation that created, because, of course, you were the Nazi kid as far as the other kids were concerned, because of who your dad was. So, as I understand it, you got into your 30s, somewhat embittered by life, and you adopted two baby girls from Georgia, and that transformed your life. That changed the way that you felt about humanity and the world and everything in it. And when they were, correct me if I'm wrong, about 15, you said you wanted to do something for the country they hailed from, for Georgia. And you asked them if they'd like to go to Georgia with you, and they said, not really.
Yeah, that was when they were 10, is when that
10.
started.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. And you went to Georgia and became involved in a set of projects. How long ago is it that you first went there?
Let's see, I started and I formed the foundation in 2005. And my first, after I got, tax-free status from the US government and formed a board of directors and did all that stuff and had some meetings, the first true, on the ground trip to identify orphanages to work with was in January of 2007.
Yeah, and as I remember, you found that the building itself was, I think you said that there wasn't one window that wasn't broken. That you
Right.
found this.
Yeah. I
Tell us
mean,
about that.
so, I was with a translator and a driver from Georgia, and we drove all over the country, basically just trying to find all the orphanages that were listed as an orphanage house in the
Mm.
country. So, that spent a week and a half just driving all over. And every time we'd find an orphanage, we'd go in and, talk to the director and tell them who we were and what we were trying to accomplish. And our goal was basically at the end of this trip, we're all going to take a vote on which one orphanage house we thought was most in need and most receptible to what we wanted.
Mm.
Because, there were some houses, even though they were in horrible condition, where the director's like, no, we don't need any help. We don't want you. And my translator kind of described it as, oh, they have the old Soviet mentality
Mm.
and they're not ready for anything like this yet. But we did find a home in Sagaramo. Director was very receptive to us. We fell in love with the kids almost immediately. There was probably 45 kids there and really bad condition. It was an old Soviet style school building that was like 4 stories high.
Mm.
It had a total of like 92 windows, and there wasn't a single window that was completely intact. There was no heating system, and that had all been ripped out for scrap metal when the wall came down and the economy of Georgia basically collapsed overnight when the Soviet Union fell.
Mm,
And it took, the country a civil war and then, uh, what happened after the war to start trying to pick themselves back up. But in the meantime, the citizens were doing everything they could just to survive,
mm,
and that including taking these older buildings and just scrapping them.
mm,
And these kids were living in this building, no heating system, no really working bathrooms. The electrical system was basically completely shot. It was just amazing how bad it was. And so we picked that one orphanage and decided to start working with them. I mean, I was really naive. Also, really didn't have a lot of financial resources. So I was just like, I'm just going to start with one
yeah.
and just do very little things. And yeah, it was an experience, a huge culture shock for me.
Mm,
Um, I think the biggest culture shock for me was when I went over there and said, hey, I want to help these kids. The first thing that really happened is the adults involved, like the director and other people, were like, well, you need to help me first before you can help the kids. So, you take a bag of, things for the kids, and half the bag ends up going to the adults and taking home to their families. At first that would make me really mad.
mm,
And I'm like, how dare they do that?
yeah.
But, once you sit back and try to understand their culture and what they've been through and how people are starving, um, I grew to accept it and understand it, that it was, part of their survival mechanism. And
Mm,
it made sense after that. But at first, it was difficult to comprehend and understand why they would do that.
mm. I mean, it's a culture of half the world, isn't it? The third world where there is poverty, that there are bribes and corruption, baksheesh, that there is money that has to be paid, and it's part of the salary of the person who does that job, and very unfortunate, but
Yeah.
inevitable where governments have failed the people completely. Um, so the wall came down what in 90, well, 89, 90,
91,
91.
91, I think. Yeah.
And how long was it before Georgia was um, free of the influence of well, I mean, it's not free of the influence. We're none of us free of the influence of Russia, but
I mean,
politically liberated from
soon
that.
after the wall came down, there was kind of like a civil war in
Mm,
Georgia where, a couple of factions were, fighting for power and control over the government. It basically ended up that Edward Shevardnadze, who was a high-ranking minister in the Soviet government, ended up consolidating power and running the country. And he was still in power when I adopted my children in 1996.
mm,
And the orphanage system at that point was terrible. I mean, it was almost a death sentence for children to be put in the orphanage system back in the 90s. There was no support, no money, and the kids were basically starving to death in the orphanage houses. So, we were really fortunate to get our two children because they were adopted directly from the hospital
mm,
and never actually entered into the orphanage system. Because at that point, Shevardnadze's wife, who was quite powerful, was adamant and completely against any foreign adoptions. And so they didn't have adoption laws written per se at that time. So the adoptions that were happening, there were very few happening back then, were, um, they were kind of happening with the help of a few Georgian ministers, and, they had doctors at these hospitals who were working really hard to save these children because they knew if these children eventually got taken out of the hospital and put in this orphanage house, that they would probably end up dying.
yeah.
Um, and I remember when I was in Georgia, I was in Georgia for like almost 3 weeks while we were completing the adoption process. We saw a special on CNN Euro where Shevardnadze's wife was interviewed, and she talked about the orphanage system. They showed pictures. It was horrible. I mean, the kids in these houses back then looked like Holocaust victims.
Yeah.
Um, and she just basically said, hey, look, this is Georgia's problem. And, we're proud of Georgian history, and we're not going to allow foreigners to come in and take these children. And she basically said, I would rather these children die than other people, take these children, foreigners, out of the country.
An amazing
And
thought.
that was really scary for us to see that. And, we were scared to death every minute of every day that our adoption would be canceled and these children would be taken away.
Mm,
So I just can't tell you how elated we were when we were finally on that airplane leaving Georgia and heading back home
mm.
with our two children.
Yeah,
And
amazing.
they were 3 months old at that time.
Yeah. And how are your daughters doing now?
They're doing well. I mean, they're both, adults. They're 30 years old. They're out on their own. One is a police officer, and she loves that job. It's
Mm.
something that she wanted to do since she was 5 years old. The other one is a certified financial planner, and she's doing well too. So they both have full-time jobs and have their own homes, and yeah, they're doing quite well.
That's great. And so tell us the story of, you first of all, you and an electrician friend went and put this building back together.
Yeah, so very soon after my very first trip, you know, yeah, my wife and I, at that time owned a residential remodeling company,
Mm,
and I was working with a customer who wanted a big addition on his house, and never really got to know him because he traveled so much. I mostly dealt with his wife, but the day came when I had to go to his house and sign a contract with him. And I remember sitting at the dining room table with him, and he was a real tech guru.
mm.
And as we were reading through the contract and stuff, he just said something like, "Oh, have you ever heard of this program called Google Earth?" I'm like, "No, I've never heard of it." And he goes, "Oh, it's really cool. Let me show it to you." And he said, "What place on the planet would you like to see?" And I said, "Sagaramo, Georgia." And so he immediately pulled it up, and I'm like, "Oh my God." And he goes, "What is Sagaramo, Georgia to you?" And I told him about the orphanage, and he was like, "Oh, wow, that is fantastic." He goes, after a day or two, he's like, "I've been thinking a lot about this, and I want to be your partner. I want to help you." And he goes, "How much money did you donate to get this started?" And I told him, he goes, "Well, I'm going to match that donation. And the next time you go to Georgia, I want to go with you."
Wow.
And so a month later, we were both on the plane together going back to Georgia, and he saw the orphanage. And, he was, you know, he's a genius when it comes to electronics, electricity, and stuff like that. And once he saw the electrical system in this home, he made it immediately his mission to completely rebuild the switchgear for this
Mm,
house so that it was safe and that the rooms had electricity and lights and stuff like that. And so we spent the rest of that trip doing that. He was the brains behind it. We tried to help him when we could, but he was down on the floor, covered in grease and stuff, and rebuilding the whole thing. We would go to an open market and try to buy the, parts that were scrapped out of other buildings and put the system back together. And then over the next couple of years, we ended up replacing all the windows, all the doors, putting a heating system in. They ended up with true bathrooms with flush toilets, running water, all new beds, new armoires for all their clothes, books and backpacks, pretty much everything they needed. And all of this was really because Gil was just so high energy and so smart and such a problem solver. He just completely transformed the Divine Child Foundation into what I thought we could do versus what we were actually able to accomplish.
mm.
And yeah, it was just an amazing experience to ride along with that and be part of it.
So, explain to us the name of your foundation, before
It's called
people think that you're a Christian organization or something of that type.
it's called the Divine Child Foundation, and it's
Yeah.
not necessarily a Christian
Mm,
organization. I mean, when I was trying to think of the name of it, I just sat down and decided to meditate and see what would come to me, and that's what came to me. And at that point, it was because I was still well within my healing process
mm.
from the abuse I received from my dad.
Yeah,
Still am, absolutely, still need
of
need
course.
healing. Um, but back then, especially, I was really kind of embarking on a spiritual educational process. of understanding from a spiritual standpoint the nature of my thoughts and how I could possibly make better choices when it came to the thoughts that were running through my head. And for me, that was a spiritual thing.
Mm.
And so for me, divine wasn't specifically intended to be Christian. It's not anti-Christian. It's just that for me, it was a spiritual thing.
Mm. Yeah, and I, as I've understood it, to elevate those children to say, that they all have whatever divinity is within them.
Yes,
And
each child is divine. Yeah.
yeah,
And the goal really was to, because of the way I felt as a child growing up, feeling worthless and essentially abandoned, that um, if there was some way I could accomplish with one or many children that they realized finally in their life that there was one person in the world that accepted them and loved them for who they were,
mm,
then that was really the goal and the mission of the Divine Child Foundation.
yeah. And I remember you telling me that very early on that looking at the children, you wondered why they weren't grateful to you, and um, that became, I think, a very important realization on your part. You talk about that perhaps.
Well, one of the biggest issues I had transitioning from childhood to adulthood was fear of rejection.
Mm,
So, my early interactions with adults after I left home, if anybody criticized me, even in a constructive way, or tried to help me in a constructive way, I would take that as rejection. And
mm,
my learned response from the interactions with my mom and dad was to shut down and then to shut out. And I got to the point where if anybody disparaged me in any way, my reaction to that would be huge. I mean, it would be, way beyond what the situation called for. And it was
mm,
because I eventually realized that I was just full of an accumulated rage that had been building and suppressed my whole life. And I ended up actually being just like my dad on the inside. And so it took a long, long time to deal with that. And when I first went to this house, these kids would look at you like, who is this guy and what does he want and why is he here? A lot of them were curious and friendly, but a lot of them were not. A
mm,
lot of them would look at you and just for an instant, and then they would turn their gaze away from you, or they would frown at you or scowl at you. And for me, my initial reaction was rejection. Oh, they're rejecting me.
mm,
I'm not good enough. And I had to like contemplate that and say, hey, wait, no, 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 no. That's not what's going on here. This is not about me. This is about
mm,
them and what's happening in their life. And these kids have been abandoned and, put into this home with 40 plus other kids that they've never known in their life and they're trying to survive. So I made it my mission to not accept it as rejection and to then try to break down the barriers to each and every one of these kids. Some kids were a lot easier than others. Some kids, it took a long time. But what I found is if you would make eye contact with them, not be any threatening in any way, not get too close, but just make eye contact with them and just give them the biggest smile, no matter what they did, no matter how they acted or anything. Eventually, those barriers all came down.
mm,
And that's when you got to the point where when you showed up the next time, the kids would come running, and excited and happy to see you versus standing off in the corner looking at like, who is this guy? What does he want? So
mm.
it was a really growing experience for me in itself.
Yeah, and things grew. You started with one orphanage, and how many were there along the way? And
There's been
bring us up to date.
several. So basically, what happened was like 15 years ago, the Georgian government, with help from USAID, which unfortunately is not happening anymore, but because of that, USAID was working really hard with the Georgian government to try to westernize their institutions.
Mm,
to get away from the Soviet model and to get things more aligned for possible interest in being part of the European Union. And one of the
Yeah.
things that they were advised about is, you really need to get these kids out of institutions and try to come up with a better way. So USAID came up with the money and a model of we'll go out into these villages and we'll buy a large home and we'll remodel it into what we call a children's home.
Mm.
And instead of having 40 to 60 to 200 kids in an orphanage house, we'll not allow more than 10 kids per house.
Okay.
And then there'll be a stable um, group of what they call nannies that will live in this house and basically run this house like a family instead of an
Mm.
orphanage. And so when the government informed us that they were going to shut Sagaramo down and that they wanted us to bid, basically, where we had to fill out a contract and say, well, this is what we would do and this is what we would commit to for 10 years, they let us bid on two houses.
Mm.
And part of that process is, we want these kids from Sagaramo that we know, if we get these two houses, we want these kids to populate these two houses because we don't want to lose touch with them.
Mm.
A lot of the kids were starting to graduate out because in Georgia, once you reach age 18 or you finish high school, you have to leave and you're not
Mm.
supported after that. And so they gave us the contract. They were familiar with our work, and we had met with government ministers quite a bit during the several preceding years that we were working at Sagaramo, so they knew of us. And so we signed that contract and we started running those two houses. And then in a fairly short period after that, there was another organization that had done the same thing that we did, where they bid on two houses, but they went bankrupt. And so the government came to us and said, would you run these two houses as well? And so we agreed to do that. And then after another period of time, they came to us and said, we're now at the point where we're ready to take severely disabled children out
Mm.
of a hospital and put them into a house like this. And at first I said no, because I kind of had a phobia about,
Mm.
severely disabled children. I didn't know anything about it. And because I was still suffering from my childhood, I just had this phobia, almost like, you know, it was a threat to me or something. I
Mm.
can't really describe it, but my director, Lawi Sartsavadze, who has been running our organization here in Georgia, she's a fantastic woman. She's a trained child psychologist, and she's, turned all of our houses into true families. She's like, Kelvin, I really want to do this. And I'm like, no, Lolly, I'm not going to do this. And it took her probably a year and a half to finally talk me into it. And so a large construction company here in Georgia actually donated a piece of land and built a brand new house for these children. And I was there on the day that these children were moved from the hospital to our house. And it was quite an experience. I kind of just stood back and watched as these children were, to me, almost lifeless. They were carried into the house. None of them could walk. None of them could speak. Most of them, like from the waist down, were nothing but like jelly. There was no, bone mass or nerve control or anything like that. I mean, these were severely disabled children.
Mm.
And I was just like, oh my God, it's like my worst phobia is coming true here, and I don't know what I'm going to do. But, I trusted Lolly. Um, so I stayed there and I kind of watched the process for like an hour, and I saw that some of these nannies who were our staff were brand new, but just specifically hired for these children at a much higher ratio of nanny per child than our other
Mm.
houses because these kids needed constant 24/7 care.
Yeah.
There was one room that was covered with like a rubber mats and had plastic balls and stuff like that. And they took several of these kids and just laid them on the floor. And finally, I was just like, you know what? Got to do it. So I went in there and I took my jacket off and I laid down on the floor next to one of these kids. and actually started playing with it. Just picking up a ball and giving it to it, and they would kind of like drop it, and it would roll across the floor, and I'd pick it up and give it back to it. And a couple hours later, that phobia was completely gone. And now it's definitely my favorite house to visit. And I visit it every time I'm here. And to see the transformation in these kids in the
Mm.
last few years since we started this house to when they get this kind of care 24/7 is amazing.
Yeah.
It is absolutely amazing. So, yeah. So right now, we're running one of our houses was turned from an orphanage house into a counseling center. It's a children's counseling center where basically, we got a grant from the Swiss government, and it was a model to take youth, usually teenagers, that were in trouble with the law, and to try to take these children and counsel them and give them vocational training to redirect them away from the criminal justice system and to help them to make better choices so they didn't end up incarcerated, that they ended up actually having a future. It's called the Compass Center. And so we're running four houses now and this Compass Center, and now there's another Compass Center in Western Georgia because this one was so successful. The government asked us to open another one in Western Georgia. So that's where we're at right now. So four houses and two counseling centers.
Yeah. What a turnaround. I mean, I've spent the last year researching a book about the Nazis, um, largely because of my concern for the rise of fascism in the world at the moment, um, under the guise of populism, under the guise of, you know, some in this country we have reform, and
Hmm.
we're seeing defection of senior politicians into this party. And of course, one of the aspects, and the Nazis didn't invent this, it was already happening in Germany when they came to power. But they had this expression, life unworthy of life. And under that rubric, and I mean, in fact, the US was actually the first place to legislate in Connecticut in the 1890s to sterilize parts of the population that were considered unworthy. And this would be very much what your father believed.
Oh, absolutely. And that really brings up a good point because, a few years back, it's been a few years now. I was being interviewed by ABC News about my
Mm,
book and about my dad, and they wanted to do, part of this is me driving out to my dad's old compound and trying to visit it, because my dad was dead, but the compound was still
mm,
there and still in the hands of the National Alliance.
yeah.
So, an ABC reporter and a cameraman rented a truck, and we got in the truck and we drove out to West Virginia and drove right to the compound gates. And I met a man there,
Mm,
and he was a young man, and he was living on the compound. He was like a caretaker,
mm,
and he had a wife and a very young son, and they were living in one of the small homes on the compound. And I got to know him pretty well. We talked a lot.
mm,
And I tried to keep an open mind. Like, he worshiped my dad, and, he was definitely a white supremacist, neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call it.
yeah.
And I tried to debate him about things back and forth. And, in a way, he kind of took a liking to me, and he kind of showed a respect. And he gave me a book called Which Way, Western Man? And it was a very large book, written by, somebody my dad knew well. And my dad actually published this book through the National Alliance. But it's a huge book, and it's all about, what's happening to the Western man and what is the Western man, going to do. And, basically, how is the white race going to survive? And here's what they need to do. But part of that book specifically talks about, children like this that are in my
Mm,
disabled home, and how the right thing to do for society is to, eliminate these children
mm,
and then eliminate their gene pool
mm,
so this doesn't happen again. And yet, I go to this house and I see these children and see that they're capable of love, and they're certainly capable of receiving love. I mean, the nannies these that are in this house, there's no doubt whatsoever that these women love these children. And I love being with them and really enjoy interacting with them. And it's like, there's people in the world that think these kids should just be put down and that they're not worth living. They're not worth it. And that's pretty much almost word for word what it says in that book. And I tried to debate this with this guy, and it didn't go really that well, but it was still somewhat respectful until he finally said, "You know what? I'm going to read your book." And after he read my book, he sent me the most scathing virtual just it was the most awful email I think I've ever received
Oh,
since writing that book. He basically told me everything that happened to me was my fault and that I was just you know, a baby little boy that needs to pull up my big boy pants and stop crying about daddy beating you and stuff like that. It was horrible. Yeah.
yeah. I
He
mean,
was so upset that I told the truth about my father.
mm,
He just couldn't tolerate it.
yeah, it isn't that interesting. I mean, to to understand the situation, I went and read three books on eugenics and genetics,
Hmm.
and something that didn't come out, which I think is worth saying, is that the Nazis completely disproved the hypothesis of the Aryan race. They did hundreds of thousands, they measured hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. They spent an enormous amount of money on the INNEB, the Ministry of Ancient Heritage, enlisted the aid of every scientist they could find. And in the end, they still could not tell you the difference between what they called a Mediterraneanoid and a Teuton. They couldn't do it. There was one population of Jews where 11% of them had blue eyes and blonde hair, which was most disconcerting.
I'm
And
sure.
so they showed that you couldn't tell. Now, of course, with modern genetics, we know that there's only one human race. We know, like it or not, and it doesn't bother me, that our ancestors were black. And that's all there is to it. And the rest
Yep.
is, you know, and that this has become such a powerful thing that the genetic differences between us are largely to do with colors, to do with the color of our skin, the color of our eyes, the color of our hair. There is very little other difference. In fact, there's more variation within subgroups of humanity than between subgroups of humanity. And the one statistic I stumbled on was that the Nazis murdered or sterilized 250,000 schizophrenics. And yet the incidence of schizophrenia in Germany today, in Mannheim, where it's been measured, is, I think, 13 times higher than is the average in 11 countries around. So this idea of a gene pool and these are bad genes, we don't know enough about that yet. Even looking at genes for intelligence or potential genes for intelligence, there's something like 4,000 genes interacting. So
Yeah.
this ignorant idea, even Richard Dawkins, who has quite a reputation, a biologist, a few years ago put out a tweet saying, well, we can do it with dogs and horses and pigeons, so why can't we do it with people? And you're going, well, you as a biologist ought to understand that training, that breeding dogs so they'll dig holes or breeding horses so they'll run races is not the same as breeding a whole human being. And then when we look at, some famous people, Einstein had a brother who was schizophrenic. Well, the genes were the same, they
Yeah.
came from the same place.
Yeah.
So it's become a sort of a religious doctrine among people, and it's a doctrine that's failed. So, and I certainly believe that unless we develop compassion for other human beings and for all of our symbiotes, all of the creatures we exist with, unless we have compassion, then we will fail. As a species, we will fail. And I see that. I see that at the moment uh, you know, incredible greed and ignorance of the world uh, is leading us down this terrible path.
It
And
is.
And
Yes.
so to see somebody who has survived what you survived, and I absolutely recommend your book, um, to give an understanding of what happens when somebody treads this lunatic path of hatred and separation and division. That, you know, the idea that you as a 6 or 7 year old should have been, you should have manned up when your father took you down to the basement, had you stripped naked and thrashed you with an electrical cord until you were unconscious. The idea that there's, it's preposterous that that such a thing, that people should take William Pierce as any kind of hero. The man was disastrously wrong in his way of being.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so true. But there's a lot of people that really look up to him
Yeah,
a
and
lot.
and we see this around the world, don't we? The kind of hero worship. I was in the Scientology cult, and I was only a customer, so I was very lucky.
Hmm.
The abuse and humiliation that was visited upon the staff in Scientology, and enslavement for any and all practical purposes. There are about 4,000 people who are in their C organization, and they're enslaved. And I came to realize as a member of that group that we project the virtues we wish we had into the leader, and the leader becomes a pseudo father, a pseudo parent, who we think embodies all of the great virtues. And however, when we look at any of these people, they have feet of clay. We all do.
Yeah,
And
that
so
is so true.
I thought, what for me, one of the great qualities was never to be angry, never to lose my temper. I wouldn't have got on with your father very well. And and when I lose my temper, and I do, um, occasionally, not often, I feel ashamed of that. I don't feel that's a quality. So when I found out that Ron Hubbard, the creator of Scientology, on a daily basis would get 3 inches away from somebody and give them what he called a severe reality adjustment by screaming at them that they were worthless and, you know, trying to destroy him and all of this nonsense. That that sense of, oh, he wasn't quite what I thought he was. In fact, he was the very opposite of it. And that is a terrible thing for people to go. They've created this kind of ideal vision of somebody, and to then realize, that they're feet of clay, that the person's was terribly weak. And there is so much of this projection going on now. So many
Yes,
people, as you say, USAID just disappeared
yes,
for purely political reasons. It's not saved a lot of money, in real terms, in terms of the American
no,
budget, but it has meant that the US now, having been the leader of the so-called free world, the non-communist world, since 1945, has given away that leadership, has said, we don't care anymore. America first. And I, I'm glad to see the resistance to that. I have been outspoken about Trump for years. Um, I do not understand what's happening, and seeing, the Epstein files this weekend, 3 million documents. We're talking on the 2nd of February here. Um, Seeing just how these collections of corruption run, where all of the money, all of the power invested here that should be going to projects such as your project,
yeah,
but are actually going to waste. They're going into military spending, and now the whole Western world is having to increase its military spending to protect against Georgia's neighbor, Russia, who've already had one try at taking Georgia, if I remember rightly. And you have a lot of Russians in Georgia now, yes?
yes, yeah. I mean, when the war started in Ukraine, quite a few Russians came to Georgia, for their various reasons. A lot of them were to escaped the draft.
Mm,
Some of them were just getting out of Russia because of everything that was going on. Um, but yeah, I mean, there were maybe 3 million. I don't know the exact amount, but a lot, in a country with, you know, not that many people. It's like a large percentage.
mm,
And unfortunately, what that's done is it's raised the cost of living here in Georgia dramatically because a lot of these Russians that came to Georgia, came with money
mm,
and they wanted a place to live, especially in the two bigger cities of Tbilisi and Batumi. And so they would go up to a place and say, hey, I'm willing to pay 2 or 3 times as much. And so then a native Georgian that's been living in an apartment for years and years and years that was paying what he could afford was suddenly booted out onto the street because the landlord said, this guy's going to pay me 3 times as much. What do you expect me to do?
yeah,
And yet, this Georgian that's been put out of their home, they have no way of making 3 times as much money because their salary hasn't changed. And so it's changed, the face of Georgia quite a bit.
mm,
Um, it's much more expensive than it used to be, especially for housing.
mm,
Um, and a lot of Georgians aren't happy with that, especially what happened between Georgia and Russia in 2008.
yeah,
Um, they don't forget that. There's a monument here right in the middle of Tbilisi called Hero Square, which is a monument to all the Georgian soldiers that were killed during um, that time. And yeah, the current Georgian government is, um, they're walking a fine line to
mm.
keep the peace.
Yes. I mean, unless and until I mean, we have the neo-traditionalist movement in Russia, which historically dates back to the division of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the 19th century, where you started getting the pan-German movement
Hmm.
that would become the Nazi movement ultimately, and the pan-Slavic movement, which so this distinction of these populations based entirely upon the language they spoke, not really based upon any genetic separation.
Hmm.
Europe's been a melting pot of peoples for
Yeah.
thousands of years. In
Yeah.
fact, Britain, we reckon that there were two waves of early settlement in Britain, one of them coming from the Middle East and the other one coming from Ukraine. So, the Angles and Saxons and the Celts and all these people, they were latecomers, they were invaders. And seeing all of that mixing and to then pretend that there's pure Slavism or pure Germanism, Aryanism, or what have you, is ludicrous.
Yeah, it is. It is.
But
And
that,
here in Georgia, I mean, I've been told that long, long time ago that originally that the general population was, blonde hair, blue eyes. But there's been so much mixing with, the Middle East. Iran is right next door, and so now 99% of the Georgian population are, somewhat a little bit of darker skin, all brown hair, brown eyes. Yeah. Um, yeah, there's been a lot of mixing, certainly in this part of the world for sure.
yeah, and wherever we go, I mean, in
Hmm.
genetic exploration, um, we share genes with Australian Aborigines.
Hmm.
We
Yep.
have some Neanderthal and Denisovan genes. We've got all sorts of crazy stuff going on there. And of course, we have that gives us hybrid vigor. That if you
Hmm.
interbreed, you create vigor. Whereas if you maintain a single strain of something, and we're seeing this with a lot of breeds of dogs, that they come to a conclusion. You can't keep breeding that small population. The Cavendish banana, which accounts, I think, for 99% of the world's bananas, all it takes is for one disease to come along, as Dutch elm disease came along or what have you. And that's the end of the banana because there are not different strains. Same with human beings, by having variation and variability, we can survive plagues and diseases, all sorts of
Hmm.
things, and have done, which is especially interesting because we are the only primate to have evolved to this. So where there are, thousands of species of beetles, as biologists said, God must have been inordinately fond of beetles. There's just one human species. And so seeing these nationalist movements, these movements that say, have Alexander Dugin, who's been an advisor to Putin, who teaches this idea. And I watched a couple of his lectures and I couldn't understand what he really meant. He was talking about neo-traditionalism and return to some values. So I read one of his books, which was thankfully very short. It was less than 100 pages. And near the end of it, he explained that what he meant was a return to the time of Ivan the Awesome. I'm giving a translation from the Russian that's not usual, but Ivan the Terrible. And that he fundamentally wanted to reintroduce serfdom or slavery. And you've got all of these people going, yes, let's do that. And the idea that by returning to some kind of what is fundamentally fascism, where you have a dictator who tells you what to do, that there'll be some benefit to humanity. And I've recently, on the one hand, fascism is a word we can define because it comes from Benito Mussolini. It's the term that he adopted, and he would then be called the first totalitarian, the first total authoritarian. So this is, he looked back to ancient Rome and said, we want a society like that. Well, I've recently been reading again about ancient Rome, the most brutal slave-based society imaginable. These people for entertainment. There's a period where 10,000 gladiators are put to a battle for public entertainment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, a third of the population of Rome, when Rome reached a population of 1 million, 300,000 of those people were slaves with absolutely no rights whatsoever. And here we have these people who, just as the young man who imagined your father some kind of savior, these people imagine that if we allow this to happen, if we make this happen, that something wonderful will happen. But the truth is that dictatorship and this idea of a benevolent dictator. My wife's writing a novel based in the time of Charlemagne in the 8th century. And here he is bringing Christianity to the West and gouging people's eyes out if they disagree with him. Kind of going, no, not really.
Oh
It's
my God.
not the way to go forward. And
No.
hopefully, with the collapse of the Trump administration, which seems to be fairly imminent, we will see, and maybe the Epstein files will clean out the corruption that runs through. We've had one of the designers of our Labour Party, Peter Mandelson, has this week resigned from the Labour Party so as not to bring further disgrace because of his association with Epstein. He was, well, the last week that Epstein was in prison for his arrest, for his conviction of soliciting a 14-year-old girl, the last week he was in prison, our business trade secretary, the British government's business trade secretary, was staying in Epstein's house in Manhattan, awaiting his release to make $1 billion deal with him.
Wow.
And I'm hoping that enough of this will come out to say, well, the Democrats have to clean house, the Republicans have to clean house, anybody that was involved there. And this whole shift towards plutocracy, which I think has always been the case, but seeing these tiny number of super rich people who have such influence on the world, that Elon Musk was able to withdraw Starlink from the Ukraine for 3 days, and it meant they couldn't defend against the Russian attack. And I don't think that one person should have that sort of power. Anyway, let me. I could and do talk about this all day, but let's move back to what you're doing now. You've moved to Georgia, and you were telling me that you've adopted a young woman. Tell me, and you're still involved with the orphanages. You're still involved with everything you're doing there. But
Yes.
tell me why you moved there and what's happening now.
Well, I mean, half of my work, because the government does basically stop supporting these children when they reach age 18,
Mm,
half of my work for the last 20 years, basically, not quite that long, has been supporting these graduates and helping them to get their feet on the ground, keeping them from falling through the cracks. I mean, I don't want a kid that grew up in my orphanage house to end up on the streets because the government says we can't help anymore.
mm,
Because, we run these houses and we pay a majority of the cost, but the government also helps us every single day. They give us a per diem per day per child.
mm,
But that stops, when these kids leave the house. And so we have to make sure that they have an opportunity for success and, to stay off the streets.
mm,
And so, a couple of years ago, there was a child who was abandoned. She was 3 years old when she was abandoned, and she grew up mostly in a orphanage house in Western Georgia, Batumi. It's on the Black Sea. It
mm,
was basically a home with 200 children. Her mom took her to the orphanage house when she was 3 and said, "I'll be back," and never came back. And the reason why this child is different is because, the majority of my kids, they're focused on one thing only, and that's survival. But, this child was different. She was really focusing on future,
mm,
on education and career, and, how am I going to survive after this? And so, at age 15, she just decided on her own that, I'm going to leave this house where I grew up and I'm going to go to Tbilisi because the educational opportunities in Tbilisi are much greater.
mm,
And there was singular focus on her future and her education, which was, paramount in her mind. And so she left that house, came to Tbilisi, and was put into one of my homes.
mm,
And, after she got there, she was kind of depressed because she left all her friends behind,
mm.
everybody she had grown up with for the last 12 years,
Yeah.
and was in a completely new environment. And, but, she immediately started focusing on her future. And one of the things that she happened to do was get herself into, some good classes for, children that showed promise.
Mm,
And, when she was suffering from this depression, one of the nannies there, who, of course, works for me, suggested that she reach out to me and just start a conversation, and that's what she did. And basically, after we got to know each other just a little bit, she said something to the effect like, I'm the only kid in my class, that this advanced class, that doesn't have a laptop computer. Can you help me? And help me get a laptop computer because it's really important to my education.
mm.
Most kids are like, can you send me a gaming system or can you give me, a new phone so I can,
Mm,
all on and on.
mm,
But, this is a kid that you could tell was really serious and she wanted a laptop for her education.
mm,
Um, and over the next year, through a lot of communication back and forth, became really close. And then at, one point, I guess I just basically fell in love with her as a daughter.
mm,
And she had told me at one point that that's one of the things that she really prayed about was one day have a father. And so I ended up basically deciding to, be a father to her. And I knew that last year, last spring, she was going to have to leave the home. And so I made the decision to come here and to get an apartment
mm,
and to bring her home with me. And then, we talked a lot about her education, and she decided that what she really wanted to be was a commercial pilot.
mm,
And so at first, we were going to try to get her a visa and bring her back to America to study. But we were turned down 3 times. We applied 3 different times, and we were turned down 3 different times. We were basically told she's an orphan. And if you adopt her legally in America, we don't care because she's 18 and you have to adopt her before the age of 16 to be considered a true, daughter or a true child as far as the immigration, system in America, thanks.
Mm,
Um, so basically, then we were told the best way is to try to get her a student visa. And, while we were in the process of trying to do that, we learned that there was an aviation university here in Tbilisi that actually has quite a good reputation. And it's a 4-year program where you basically end up with an engineering degree and a commercial pilot's license at the
mm,
completion of that 4 years. And, you have to pass a series of really stringent exams to be able to qualify for this. So she decided to go ahead and take these exams just in case. And she passed them all, which was a miracle because the village schools, but I had paid for tutors for her last year and a half
mm,
in high school. And she worked so hard at it, she actually passed these exams. And then she came to me and she goes, "You know what, Dad? The cost of this university is like 1/5 of the cost if you took me to America. Why don't we just stay here? Let me study here. And when I get my commercial pilot's license, then I'll be able to get a visa and I'll be able to fly wherever I want to."
mm.
So, yeah, she just finished her first semester. She passed all her exams and she's on winter break right now and getting ready to start her second semester.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, your life is an inspiring story. I hope that people watching this will feel that they should contribute to the
Mm.
work you're doing. And if you let Spike know where they can contribute, um, that would be good. Um, it's such a pleasure to catch up with you.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
pleasure seeing you again, John.
and we must we must make it, not quite so long a gap before we next talk.
Yeah, let's do
Um,
that.
and do keep in touch with me about any developments with your daughter. I'm fascinated um, by what you've done and by the great good use you've made of your life so
Oh, well,
far.
thank you. Well, thank you.
Grand.
All right. Good
Yep.
talking to you, John.
Thank you so much, Calvin. Cheer
All
bye.
right. All right. Bye-bye. And take care.
You too.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.